If there were no eternal consciousness in a man, if at the foundation of all there lay only a wildly seething power which writhing with obscure passions produced everything that is great and everything that is insignificant. If a bottomless void never satiated lay hidden beneath all, what then would life be but despair?
Hello there. We're back at the very place where our journey on Søren Kierkegaard began. And this will be the very last episode on him. And today we're discussing the religious sphere.
Unfortunately, even though one might live 100% ethically and try to live the best possible life according to some ethical system which they've discovered themselves, the sickness still lurks about in the unconscious, the sickness unto death, despair.
I would probably say that most people, at least in this time in history, will be satisfied with the ethical sphere. But the sickness of despair will always come from time to time in various existential crises, such as middle-age crisis. Some solves this crisis with maybe buying a motorcycle or divorcing and finding a younger partner. Well, you know what I mean. But there is a way to get rid of this sickness for good. And that way is with the religious sphere.
This is probably the trickiest one to understand, and it's a bit murky and also a bit dangerous, I would say. But I'm gonna do my best. I'm mostly gonna talk about 3 books, 2 of which we've already encountered: Either or, Stages on Life's Way, and Fear and Trembling.
So we'll begin with Fear and Trembling. And the point of departure in this book is the story of Abraham and Isaac.
And it came to pass after these things, that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham. And he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, and saddled his ass, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up, and went unto the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted up his eyes, and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, and laid it upon Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and the knife. And they went both of them together. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together. And they came to the place which God had told him of, and Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven, and said, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him, for now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram, and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son.
This story of Abraham and Isaac is very important for Kierkegaard because it asks a question. Can there be something higher to strive for than the ethical life? Or as Søren put it, is there such a thing as a teleological suspension of the ethical? Remember, telos is the end purpose of a thing. So in the aesthetic sphere, it is sensual pleasure in the moment, and in the ethical sphere, that would be acting morally in society. But can there really be something higher than the ethical sphere? That is the question.
So God tells Abraham to sacrifice one of his dearest possessions, namely his only son. And this would always be considered murder according to any ethical system. For instance, the philosopher Immanuel Kant analyzed the same story with the conclusion that it was clearly wrong of Abraham even to consider sacrificing his son. But Søren is not so sure.
So Søren spends a whole chapter asking whether a teleological suspension of the ethical is at all possible. Because if it isn't, Abraham will just end up as a simple murderer of his son.
This book as well is written under a pseudonym, namely Johannes de Silencio. And the book begins with the description of a man who came across this exact story, and he never really could let it go. I do believe the man he's describing is actually Søren himself. Once upon a time, there was a man who as a child had heard the beautiful story about how God tempted Abraham, and how he endured temptation, kept the faith, and a second time received again a son contrary to expectation. When the child became older, he read the same story with even greater admiration, for life had separated what was united in the pious simplicity of the child. The older he became, the more frequently his mind reverted to that story. His enthusiasm became greater and greater, and yet he was less and less able to understand the story. At last, in his interest for that, he forgot everything else. His soul had only one wish, to see Abraham, one longing to have been witness to that event. That man was not a thinker. He felt no need of getting beyond faith. He deemed it the most glorious thing to be remembered as the father of it, an enviable lot to possess it, even though no one else were to know it. That man was not a learned exegete. He didn't know Hebrew. If he had known Hebrew, he perhaps would easily have understood the story and Abraham.
So we can only imagine that the story of Abraham and Isaac had been bothering Kierkegaard for quite some time. Here he writes, "The ethical expression for what Abraham did is, that he would murder Isaac. The religious expression is that he would sacrifice Isaac. But precisely in this contradiction consists the dread which can well make a man sleepless. And yet Abraham is not what he is without this dread.
In order to understand Abraham better, there's a discussion in Fear and Trembling on the highest form of the ethical, namely the tragic hero. He discusses Agamemnon and also his favorite, Socrates. Socrates can be seen as an intellectual tragic hero. He was sentenced to death by the city of Athens, and during the wait for the carrying out of the execution, he had many chances to escape, but he thought an escape was a crime against what he believed in. He had lived in the city for most of his life and enjoyed all its benefits and pleasures. Then, if the city deems him a criminal, then he must accept that too, just as much as he accepted its pleasures. The story of Agamemnon is very close to that of Abraham, which is why Søren discusses it in depth. Agamemnon had angered the goddess Artemis, and the war against Troy was upon them. And in order for the Greek army to arrive safely at the beaches near Troy, he had to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia. The big difference between Agamemnon and Abraham, though, is that Agamemnon had a reason for the sacrifice. Abraham had none.
All these people's deeds might seem extraordinary, but to Søren, they are still very much in the ethical sphere. But not Abraham. He suspended the ethical to a higher telos. He gave up the ethical sphere for complete irrationality in faith in God. He became a knight of faith.
If you analyze the story of Abraham and Isaac, there certainly is no rationale for the sacrificial act. It's not like Abraham was unable to care for his son, or that God made a case why he should give up his most precious. It is a complete surrender of rationality into the hands of God.
I want to clarify one thing, because I don't want anyone go off and kill a bunch of people in the name of God. Because the way I look at it is that Søren is only using the story of Abraham and Isaac to clarify a point if a suspension of the ethical is at all possible. Because either you are satisfied with the ethical sphere, but then you're always gonna have this despair to live with, or you take a complete irrational leap of faith.
Also, some theologians say that at the time of Abraham was a time when God interacted with his creation, and that wouldn't happen the same way today.
I also believe that the religious sphere was one of the reasons why Søren broke off his engagement with his beloved Regine. The ethical sphere just wasn't enough for him. And he believed himself that if he married Regine, he would make her really unhappy.
Our relationship cannot turn into a marriage. Why not? Because I am locked away in my melancholy. That I knew from the beginning, but I believed the task was to conceal. But then I would have known that such is not marriage. But what if she wants to wed me anyways? I can't let it happen, for it would be an insult to her as I see it. For a marriage, there needs to be a wedding. What is a wedding? It is the taking of an oath, with mutual obligations. But a mutual obligation needs a mutual understanding, and she doesn't understand me at all. In this case, what would my oath mean? Nothing. Would it be a wedding? No, it would be a profanity. Even if we were to be wed 10 times, I would not be married to her, but she would be to me.
That quote was from the last part of Stages on Life's Way. It too is written pseudonymously, but it really is Søren reminiscing about his breakup with Regine.
The story of Abraham must have had a great impact on Søren. He gave up a happy ethical life, but he knew that his melancholy would get the best of him if he had decided to marry Regine. It was just simpler for him to break it all up.
The last aspect of the religious sphere that I want to discuss is from Either Or. In the last part, it is a letter written by a pastor addressed to Judge Wilhelm, the ethical man which we discussed in the last episode.
So whenever doubt makes him anxious with the particular, whenever it teaches him that he suffers too much or is tried beyond his powers, he forgets the finite in the infinite thought that he is always in the wrong. Every time the anxiety of doubt makes him sorrowful, he lifts himself above the finite into the infinite, for this thought that he is always in the wrong is the wing on which he soars over finitude. It is the longing with which he seeks God. It is the love in which he finds God. So against God, we are always in the wrong.
I really like this one, because to me, Søren is really taking a Socratic approach towards religion and God, because he's saying, when it comes to God, we're always in the wrong. Or as Socrates would have put it, the only thing I know is that I know nothing. So, to summarize the whole problem here, either one is content with the aesthetic sphere or the ethical sphere, but then one must tackle the despair of infiniteness and meaninglessness head on. Or one can take a leap of faith and trust in God to remedy the sickness unto death.
You have to realize there is no such thing as rationality when it comes to faith. Against God, we're always in the wrong. There is no such thing as knowledge about God. We're always in the wrong. So you just gotta take that leap.